Okay, we are going to get started here. This is the first part of a 7-part series on the agreement of sale. So we're going to dive into this 14-page contract and take 7 hours to go over it. Now, obviously, when you go over with a client, you're going to want to do it efficiently in 10 to 15 minutes. But hopefully, by the end of this, you'll have a better understanding of the contract and know what's in it, where it's at, and be able to cite it quickly and promptly so that you look very professional to your client, okay? So the first page of the contract, and I have it highlighted here for you to see, says standard agreement for the sale of real estate. And right below it, it says this form is recommended and approved for, but not restricted to use by the members of the PAR, okay? So what does that mean? Basically, it means that you don't have to use this form if you're a realtor. It's suggested, but you don't have to. Now, why should you use it? Does anybody know? Tim?
I gotta unmute. Sorry about that.
It's all right.
You're asking why we should use this form?
Exactly.
Number one, it was written by Jim Goldsmith and the Pennsylvania Association of Realtors. So it's in our best interest to fill in the blanks. We're not attorneys that can create language. So, and for our protection and our E&O insurance and our what's been written up by Jim Goldsmith, this form is here to protect us. And it is a plain language form.
Yep, that is correct. Especially for E&O purposes and legal purposes. You don't want to show up at a court case with a contract that was written on a napkin that doesn't have the who, what, where, when, and why of the deal. So it's very important to use this form, okay? And any other forms inside the zip forms that's available to us.
Kong, I have a question. It's Tara.
Yeah, Tara.
So when I did West Virginia, West Virginia forms are like there's some available, there's some not available, but I was told at that time we could use a neighboring state's form if we needed it. So for instance, I did a backup contract on a property in Greencastle and I couldn't find a backup addendum under PA. So I used the Maryland backup addendum.
Okay.
Is that still a right thing to do, I guess, is the question?
I don't know the exact answer to that. Maybe Tim can answer. My suggestion would be if you can't find the form, just call me and I'll help you find it because we most likely will have it somewhere. It's just
yes, I would not use another state's form for our state.
Right.
Okay. Because well, I guess that wouldn't be another state because then also in Maryland, there's forms under the Frederick Association that aren't under the actual Maryland forms. And some of the agents will say, don't pull from Frederick forms. Well, sometimes that's the only place you can find them. So that's why I was curious.
Right.
So
We're a little more uniform in our forms than other states as well. So.
Okay.
Yep. Okay. So the next box that we come across says at the top center, parties. This is the who. Who is buying? Who is selling? Please fill it out completely. Okay. Next section is the property. This is the what. What is being transferred? You're going to want to fill that out completely. Now, I noticed that a lot of people fill in the tax ID and then leave the identification blank, and that's why I highlighted the identification. If you look in the tax record, you should be able to find at least a lot number or a deed book page number that is in there. And that's what you should use to fill that out, just to give one more piece of identification to this property, especially when you're selling like in a brand new neighborhood where things can get mixed up land-wise, parcel number-wise. You want to have a second piece of identification. So if you have the lot number, then you know exactly this is the lot that we were talking about, okay? Next box, buyer's relationship with PA licensed broker. Okay. I have written down here, you see how the box is divided into two? There's a left side and a right side. The left side is going to be the broker information. It's talking about the broker. Okay. The right side is the licensee / agent. That's the agent information and the type of agency you have with this particular buyer. Okay. So a lot of times people ask, well, what check mark box do I check? Okay. So you have to ask yourself, well, what's the broker's role with this buyer? And what's my role with the buyer? Okay. So I'm not sure if you printed out the sample that I had printed. Buyer agency on the agreement of sale. So the first scenario I have is you, a licensee at RE/MAX First Advantage, represents both buyer and seller. Okay. So in this case, on the left side, the broker is a dual agent because they represent both the buyer and seller through you. Okay. Does everybody understand that? And then since you represent both the buyer and seller, on the right side, at the very bottom, you're a dual agent. Okay. The next scenario we come up with is you, a licensee at RE/MAX First Advantage, represent the buyer for a home listed by RSR Realtors. Okay. So the broker in this case is representing the buyer, our broker, RE/MAX First Advantage, and RSR is representing the seller. So on the left side, RE/MAX First Advantage brokerage is representing as a buyer agent. And you, as the licensee on the right side, you are representing the buyer as a buyer agent, where all company licensees can represent the buyer.
See a lot of people do that wrong all the time, Kwong, where they
Yes.
put designated. Yeah.
Now, you, a licensee at RE/MAX First Advantage, represent the buyer, and our own Don Moberg, a licensee also with RE/MAX First Advantage, represents the seller. So on the left side, RE/MAX First Advantage represents both the buyer and the seller in this case. So RE/MAX First Advantage is the dual agent. Okay. So being that RE/MAX First Advantage is the dual agent, what happens then is RE/MAX designates you to represent the buyer and Dawn designated to represent the seller. So you are a buyer agent with designated agency, and only the licensee named above represent the buyer. Okay. So really those are the three most popular types of representation in a real estate transaction. Is you either represent both sides, you represent one of the sides, or the company represents both sides and you represent one side and another agent in the office represents another side. Okay. Any questions? Okay.
If you don't know what to do, call us and ask, because that's one of the most frequently asked questions.
Morgan, what's up?
Okay, go ahead, Claire. Oh my gosh. We have been using buyer agent with designated agency regardless of the broker, like every single time. So can you just explain a little bit more in depth why that's incorrect? Or
Sure. Let's just go back to this scenario here.
Well, the easiest way to explain that question, Kong, right, would be designated agency only applies when the company represents both the buyer and the seller.
Right.
So if you're selling a Coldwell Banker property, you are a buyer's agent, not a designated agent.
Right.
okay,
Yeah, designation only occurs when the company represents both buyer and seller. So for example, Kira, if you wrote an offer for Morgan's property then we designate you as the buyer agent,
Right.
Morgan as the, designate her as the seller agent.
I think, like, what does it just mean though when it says like all company licensees represent buyer?
Don't let that confuse you, okay? What that basically means is, for example, if need be, we can have somebody else represent the buyer for you in your absence.
I
Okay.
didn't hear the question, Colin. What was it?
What's that?
I couldn't hear the question. What did she say?
Oh, she said, what does it mean about all company licensees represent buyer?
Okay.
Yeah, and that's really the main purpose of that. Okay,
Thank you.
you're welcome. Good question. So the next box we come to, same thing, seller relationship with PA licensed broker. Again, the left side talks about the broker. The right side talks about the licensee / agent. Okay. Now, if they're not represented, you can check mark the no business relationship at the very top. But if they are represented, obviously you fill out the left and the right side. So again, a little quiz here for you. You, a licensee at Remax First Advantage, represent both seller and buyer. So again, Remax First Advantage on the left would be a dual agent, okay? And you representing both the seller and buyer, you're a dual agent. So check mark the very last box as dual agent, okay? You, a licensee at Remax First Advantage, represents the seller, and Don Moberg this time represents the buyer. You're both in the same company, so the same company is now the dual agent, okay, on the left side. On the right side, Remax First Advantage designates you to represent the seller and designates Don Moberg to represent the buyer, okay? And then the last scenario, you, a licensee at Remax First Advantage, represent the seller, and RSR this time brings you the buyer. So this time you are the seller agent for Remax First Advantage. And then on the right side, the licensee is a seller agent. Okay. All right. Moving on.
Before you move past page 1,
Yes.
let's discuss the box that you didn't go over.
The transaction licensee.
Correct. Does anybody want to explain to me what transaction licensee means? If
I
not,
believe that there's no representation. You're just writing up the contract, because I've gotten a phone call about that one.
okay. We very rarely ever want to use that.
Mhm.
Okay. And the reason is this. For instance, I had an agent come to me the other day. The agent from Keller Williams and our agent decided that they would both be transaction licensees in this deal. And I said, no, you can't do that. And they said, why? You know, we're only getting paid a reduced commission. The commission has nothing to do with it. A transaction licensee literally prepares paperwork for a buyer and a seller. So if a buyer and a seller have met, they've talked, they've agreed, they want to buy this property, they know what they're going to do, they ask you to write it up and you get paid $1,000, that's a transaction licensee. But the moment you say to a buyer, are you getting a home inspection? Now you're giving advice. A transaction licensee can't give advice to a buyer or a seller. So it's almost impossible to be a transaction licensee in our business because you cannot give any advice to anybody. So my suggestion would be never use that box. And if you're thinking of using that box, call Kong, Brooks, or I first.
So Tim, you're saying even just filling out the contract you have to ask them questions regarding how the contract is to be signed or initialed. So therefore you become a buyer's agent or whatever, not a transaction licensee. Is that what you're saying?
If you start giving them advice, if they come to you and say, look, we've decided that we want to buy this house for $200,000. We're going to have a home inspection, a radon test, and a termite inspection. We're going to settle on blah, blah, blah. And we need you to write this up. You can write it up. But if you start writing it up and you start asking them questions and you start giving them advice, well, should I have a home inspection or not have a home inspection? Well, I don't know. It's a good idea to have a home inspection. What if you buy it and something happens? The moment you start giving any advice, you're no longer a transaction licensee.
Okay.
So it's a really difficult thing to do, because anytime you're filling out this contract, you're going to explain things and start to give advice. It's really hard not to give advice. So you're better off just representing a party in the transaction. Represent someone.
And then the other party not represented unless they want their own representation.
Yeah, they can be unrepresented, you know. But transaction licensee is like for instance, if you decide that you're going to represent the buyer in this transaction to protect the buyer and write up the offer, you can mark on the seller side, no business relationship. Seller is not represented by a broker. And that way you're just representing the buyer to whom you can give advice to. It's very difficult to represent a buyer and not give advice. So transaction licensees are very hard to do.
Yeah. The last box on the first page talks about dual and/or designated agency. A broker, which in this case for us is Remax First Advantage, is a dual agent when Remax First Advantage represents both buyer and seller in the same transaction. A licensee, the agent, is a dual agent when a licensee represents buyer and seller in the same transaction. All of brokers' licensees are also dual agents unless there are separate designated agents for buyer and seller. If the same licensee is designated for buyer and seller, the licensee is a dual agent. And then I highlight at the very bottom there, by signing this agreement, buyer and seller each acknowledge having been previously informed of and consented to dual agency if applicable. So there in the contract is written permission for you to be a dual agent, if applicable. Okay. Any questions there? Yes.
I also included in the chat box, if anybody has confusion over dual and designated agency, Jim Goldsmith wrote a really good article that's on PAR's website. So that's included in the chat box.
Awesome. We'll email that out later then too with the video as well. Thanks for finding that, Brooks. Okay, page 2. Now, lastly, initial at the bottom, obviously. And then one other thing that I noted too in the blue there at the very bottom is the revision date and the release date. So you want to be using the most current contract, and this is the most current one, okay? Page 2, section number 1. By this agreement, comma, dated, you want to write the date there. Now, whatever date you write there is not necessarily the execution date. It's just the date when this contract was written, okay? Section 2, purchase price and deposits. Section A is the purchase price, and you see the little dollar sign there? That's where you put the number, the price, the numerical number. Right below that, it starts off with a parentheses that I highlighted and then wrote in spell out number like check. And then it ends with US dollars. So you want to write out the numerical number, spell it out like you would on a check. Okay. And that's to be paid by buyer as follows. So this goes into the deposit money. The first choice you have is the initial deposit, and it's within 5 days if you leave it blank. I always fill out all the blanks anyways, even if there is a pre-filled number there. I still fill in either 5 or 4 or 3 or 2 or 1, whatever it is, just so that it cannot be changed later on or altered. Number 2 talks about additional deposits within blank days of the execution date. Now you can use that to add more deposit money. For example, let's say 21 days after the execution of the contract, because on day 20, your home inspection contingency has expired. So, you know, part of the agreement was you would put more deposit down after the inspections were complete or after the appraisal is complete, okay? And then line 3 is blank for you to fill out. Again, I've seen people use that blank for after a satisfactory home inspection or satisfactory appraisal report. Put a number of their choice down there for additional deposit. And then lastly there, I underline remaining balance will be paid at settlement. So again, that's how the seller will be paid, through the deposit and then the remaining funds to be paid at settlement. Okay. B, all funds paid by buyer, including deposits, will be paid by check, cashier's check, or wired funds. Now, the next sentence is a big one because Seth is always on you about this. All funds paid by buyer within 30 days of settlement, including funds paid at settlement, will be by cashier's check or wired funds, but not by personal check. Okay. Does anybody know why that's there?
The 30 days,
Yes.
because it has to be held in escrow for 30 days in order for it to be released, because it could be withdrawn. Like they could, like the company has to hold it in escrow for at least 30 days.
Correct. There's also some lenders may need to see the funds clear before they issue commitment. And that's one of the faster ways to do it. Okay.
I've also had people use what are they called that you get, like money orders, and some lenders will not accept a money order as proof of EMD payout. It has to either, it has to show where it's coming out of the account.
Exactly. Because anybody can purchase a money order for somebody else.
Yes.
So, yep, you may need a gift letter then if the lender calls you out on it. C, deposits, regardless of the form of payment, will be paid in US dollars to broker for seller unless otherwise stated here. So last night on Facebook, there was a big conversation about Bitcoin. And I think another agent mentioned that the contract, you always go back to the contract and what does it say? And it says in US dollars. So, you know, for proof of funds, deposit money, obviously you're going to want it in US dollars. Okay. And it spells it out right there. Why is there a blank spot after that? Jim, do you know why? You're muted.
So if it's not in US dollars, you said, I'm sorry, Kwong.
No, why is there a blank line for you to fill out after C there?
Okay. Because you can actually, the buyer can hold it in escrow too. It doesn't have to be the seller's side that holds it in escrow.
Right. You can designate who's holding the deposit money, whether it's the buyer's title company, the buyer agent, real estate company, or it could be title company, construction company, whatever. So, you know, you just have to fill it out. Generally speaking, it's mostly the listing brokerage. Okay. And what form goes with that line?
The deposit money notice.
Notice. yeah.
Correct. Yep. Now, when do you not have to fill out the deposit money notice?
Do you want me to answer it?
If your
Yes.
brokerage is holding, if your brokerage is holding the deposit and you're on both sides of the transaction, is that right?
Yep.
An in-house transaction, correct?
Yep. Okay. Part C there continues to talk about where it can be held. Only real estate brokers are required to hold deposits in accordance with the rules and regulations of the State Real Estate Commission. Checks tendered as deposit monies may be held uncashed pending the execution of this agreement. So until you have an absolute agreement, you don't have to deposit the check. But as soon as you have a executed contract and the check is in hand, how many days do you have to deposit it?
3?
Bob, do you know the answer?
2 business days.
Yep. Within 2 business days. Okay, any questions on that section? It's pretty simple and self-explanatory, but sometimes things can get a little tricky when other agents are doing other things that try to throw you off there. Section 3 talks about seller assist if applicable. Seller will pay $blank. So that's where you fill in the number. Or blank percent. That's where you fill in the percent of purchase price, 0 if not specified, towards buyer's cost as permitted by the mortgage lender, if any. So again, if you have seller assist, I would fill out the number if you're as well as the percent. Okay, if you're writing in 3%, like a round percentage number, fill in the number as well. Okay, but if it's just like off the cuff number of $5,000 on a $265,000 house, put in 5,000. Okay, and then you can leave the percent blank. Now, Morgan?
We have a question over here about filling out both. So it says like seller will pay, so if we put like, for example, just like 5,000 there,
Right.
or like, 5% or whatever, wouldn't it be easier to put the percentage and not the other one in case like the sales amount changes, like based on appraisal or something, or?
It just depends. I always like to put in a real number. You can always change it later on with a change in terms form. But I always like to fill in an exact number as well as the percent.
Okay.
Just to be sure that there's no argument about it. Now, the next line, we don't have to deal with this very much right now, but in the past, we've had several arguments about it. Seller is only obligated to pay up to the amount or percentage which is approved by mortgage lender. Okay, so I have down a sample here in our notes here. Sample, the contract says the seller is willing to pay $8,500 towards the buyer's closing costs, but the lender only approves $7,000. What happens to the $1,500?
Becomes the buyer's responsibility.
Right. The seller is only obligated to pay up to whatever the lender approves. And in this case, the lender only approved $7,000. So they're out $1,500.
We've had that situation, and what I've done in the past then, since the seller has agreed, is ask the listing agent if they would maybe cover part of the 1% part of the transfer tax.
Mm-hmm.
If the lender will even allow. It depends on if they pick up on that part of it also.
Right. Tim, we've done some creative things back in the day too with this. We've asked the seller to pay for a home warranty on their side.
Yep, or 2-year home warranty.
Right.
We also put the pressure on the lender,
Mm-hmm.
and we've done principal pay downs.
Yep.
Where the lender will allow the difference to be put down on the principal of the loan,
Right.
since there are not additional closing costs. The first thing most agents want to try to do is get it in a transaction fee and kick it back. You don't want to do that, especially if you turned in a buyer broker form that has a transaction fee listed. You just need to find additional expenses that are able to be put on the settlement sheet that are lender approved.
Yep.
Tim, where I've seen it becomes a problem is if the buyer needs that money to close, like if the closing costs are enough that they actually need the money to, so if you put it into something else, it doesn't cover them, it doesn't allow them to get to settlement. Does that make sense?
Yep. The big thing again is really when we haven't had this issue in the last couple of years because nobody's paying closing cost help.
Right.
When we get back to having this issue, because the cycle will return and we'll get back to seller concessions. When we do that, you literally need to make sure the lender is on board, because another easy way to do it with the lender, if you have enough time, is to pay a point or two to buy the rate down. That's the easiest way. The problem is all the disclosures and the time frames. So, you know, if you've gotten, you know, $10,000 in closing costs help from the seller, and your lender says, oh my God, we only need 7, buy the rate down. But you need to determine that up front.
Yep. Yeah, definitely get an estimated cost sheet from the lender ahead of time, and this can be avoided because, you know, a buyer in their head, they're thinking, you know, I'm buying this house for 300 grand with 10K help, so I'm really only paying 290. But then when they only get 7,500 in help, now they're thinking, well, I'm paying 290 500 for this house. So it's their perception that they're leaving money on the table. Okay. Section 4 talks about settlement and possession. Section A, settlement date is blank or before if buyer and seller agree. Okay, so you put in a settlement date there of, let's say, April 17th. The buyer needs to move it up because they're going to be homeless. They sold their house on April 13th. What do you need to do to change that? Morgan.
You would need a change in terms.
Yep.
To move the settlement date. We do have one question, if we can interrupt for just 1 second. Can you, we want to explain what?
We were just discussing here on the side about the seller assist. So you were saying that under seller assist, that could be for not necessarily closing costs, but other types of costs that the seller is covering, correct?
Well, the intention is to cover the closing costs for the buyer. What we're talking about then was overages when, you know, you write in the contract that you asked for 8,500, but the bank only allows for 7,000. And we're coming up with creative ways to use up that $1,500 that the seller had agreed to give, just in other forms, maybe like a home warranty or something like that. But if you can't come up with anything and the bank won't allow for you to do anything, then the buyer has lost out on $1,500.
Okay, so then let's say they do accept it and say, yep, we're going to use that $1,500 towards other things. Maybe this is out of the realm of what we're talking about today, but my brain went to whenever we close out a deal in the MLS and it asks for seller concessions, yes or no, whatever.
Right.
What is considered a concession and what is not? Because I was under the understanding that that seller assist is the seller concessions, but if that amount can be attributed to other things. I
Yeah,
just want to be accurate with that.
it could be. It could be, there's also a box in the MLS for seller repair as well. So
Okay,
yes, it could be. Whatever is in that box and it's been accepted and used, that's what would go in the MLS.
okay, in the seller assist box.
Yes.
Okay, okay,
Thank
thank you.
Yep. Okay, so back to settlement and possession. B. Settlement will occur in the county where the property is located or in an adjacent county during normal business hours, unless buyer and seller agrees otherwise. So we're in Cumberland County. We sell a house out in Bucks County. And we tell everybody, you got to come here to settle. Will that work? Jim?
I'm trying to think if Bucks borders Cumberland County. I have to look at my map. Paul,
No,
but
that's
if it
Philly.
does- If that's Philly, okay. Then I would say no, because it's not adjacent,
Right. Unless
Yeah.
otherwise agreed upon,
right?
right? So adjacent means it has to be touching.
Okay,
Okay. C, at time of settlement, the following will be prorated on a daily basis between buyer and seller, reimbursing where applicable. Current taxes, real estate taxes, school taxes, rents, interest on mortgage assumptions, condominium fees and HOA fees, water and or sewer fees, together with any other lienable municipal service fees. All these charges will be prorated for the period covered. Then I have highlighted, seller will pay up to and including the date of settlement, and buyer will pay for all days following settlement, unless otherwise stated here. Okay. So in my little notes here, I wrote down that, let's say the settlement date again is April 17th. Okay. So the seller is responsible for all those liens up until that day, 4/17. And then the buyer is responsible starting 4/18. Okay. And that's there in the contract. So you have a seller that says to you, well, I'm moving out on the 17th. They should be paying that. Okay. That's where you point to them that that's where it's stated that they pay up to settlement date and including settlement date. Okay. D, for purposes of prorating real estate taxes, the periods covered are as follows. 1, municipal tax bills for all counties and municipalities in PA are for the period from January 1 to December 31st. So your real estate tax for local, county, municipals, local, that is on a calendar year basis. Okay, January 1 to December 31st. The second part states school tax bills for the Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Scranton school districts or for the period from January 1 to December 31st. So they are on a calendar cycle for Philly, Pittsburgh, and Scranton. Everybody else, their school bills are for the periods of July 1 to June 30th. Okay, that's their fiscal year. I think we all know that because that's when most of us get our tax bills is, you know, for school taxes, we get them in August and it has to be paid before the end of September to get that discount rate. So, and that's why, because the fiscal year for school, for everybody else other than those 3 school districts, is June to end of July. I'm sorry, July to end of June. G, possession is to be delivered by deed existing keys and physical possession to a vacant property free of debris with all structures broom cleaned at day and time of settlement, unless seller, before signing this agreement, has identified in writing that the property is subject to a lease. So with G, it talks about the expectations of the home on the day of settlement, that it has to be broom clean. It doesn't say professionally clean, it says broom clean, free of debris. So, you know, if they're staining on carpets and stuff like that, that's been disclosed already, that's not something that a buyer can really ask to have professionally clean, as long as the carpet's been swept and it's free of debris. It's just stained. That was disclosed. Okay. Yes,
Oh, yeah, you skipped E and F.
I did. I just noticed that.
Oh, intentionally? Okay.
Yeah. So I'm going to go back to E here. Conveyance from seller will be by fee simple deed of special warranty unless otherwise stated here. Okay, what the heck is fee simple deed of special interest? So I pulled up, let's see here. The definitions of some of these terms. So we have a special warranty deed, okay? So what is that? Right in the center there, special warranty deed. This deed is slightly different from the warranty deed. This special warranty deed only encompasses the time the property was owned by the current seller, not its entire history. This means the warranty only covers issues that may have occurred during the seller's time of ownership, and not any issues that may have occurred before that. Typically, this type of deed is used with commercial properties or residential real estate. Okay. Now, the fee simple part, absolute fee simple interest. This type of interest is exclusively owned by the seller, that gives the seller the sole power in selling the real estate. So what it states is the seller has the right to sell this property, and they are guaranteeing that during their ownership, there isn't any other liens or any encumbrances that could hinder clear title during their ownership. Okay. Does anybody have any questions on that? F, payments of transfer taxes will be divided equally between buyer and seller unless otherwise stated here. So lately, with the competitive offer situations, we've had buyers offer to pay the seller side of the transfer tax. And you get agents writing it on a special addendum, on the last page of the contract, all over. All they had to do was come here and put in there that the seller will pay 0% and buyer pays 2%. That's where you put it. You don't need a special addendum or anything on page 10. It's right here written, and there's a blank line for you to state otherwise. Okay. The last section, H, of settlement and possession. If seller has identified in writing that the property is subject to a lease, possession is to be delivered by deed, existing keys, and assignment of existing leases for the property, together with the security deposit and interest, if any, at day and time of settlement. Now, the next part is pretty important. Seller will not enter into any new leases nor extend existing leases for the property. So the seller, if you represent a seller and they want to extend the lease and put the property while the property's under contract, they can't do that without consent from the buyer. Okay. Or if they say, well, I don't know, this deal might fall through and I'm not feeling very good about it, I'm going to go find a tenant. Again, can't do that unless they have permission from the buyer to do so. especially in a multi-unit. You'll deal with this more when you do multi-units, okay? Without the written consent of buyer, buyer will acknowledge existing leases by initialing the leases at the execution of this agreement. So if you are representing the seller, I would have the leases at least up front so that you can have the buyer initial them. Okay. Now I highlighted the tenant occupancy property addendum, and if there is a tenant, this is suggested to be attached to the agreement of sale if there's a tenant. Okay, and it goes into a little more depth than what's on the contract as far as, you know, the lease is the buyer gonna, the buyer for the property accepting the leases as they are written, or they can back out because of the leases after they receive them. Okay. Last section of page 2. Date time is of the essence. A, written acceptance of all parties will be on or before. So whatever date you put there is the day that both parties have to have the contract executed by. Okay. Now, here's what I've seen lately is you negotiate with somebody and that date has passed. Okay. It's March 17th and the date on that contract is March 16th. Okay. But everybody accepted the contract, didn't make that change. And you turn in the deposit money, the seller accepts it by depositing it into the listing agent's escrow account. So you're going through the deal, through the motions, and then all of a sudden the buyer says, well, I want to back out because that acceptance date, we didn't accept it by that date. The seller didn't accept by that date. Can they back out? Jim?
That's a good question. I've always got them to change it and initial it, Kong, but I would say no once you accept the deposit. Is that correct?
Jim Goldsmith says there's a continuance with the deal. So if they had a problem with that, you should talk about it right then and there. And it is very good practice to make that change as you're changing the contract before execution. But once the buyer makes a move to purchase the property, for example, turning over deposit money and applying for mortgage, they're kind of continuing with the deal. So, and as far as the seller, they accepted the deposit money and took their house off the market. So they are accepting the buyer's money and this contract as well. So there's a continuance there, and you can't just go back and say, well, you know, that date has passed. So, but again, it's just good practice to have that date match up with the day that you have it executed, or at least afterwards. Okay. Tim, any comment on that?
No, I agree 100% with what you're saying.
Okay.
The only other comment is when we get into more of the addendums as part of this contract, dates are very important. Keeping track of dates are very important. And again, when we get into it more, we'll explain that if you're getting close to a date, just amend it, send a change of terms.
Yep. Part B, the settlement date and all other dates and times identified for the performance of any obligations of this agreement are of the essence and are binding. So the dates are binding. Okay. C, execution date of this agreement is the date when buyer and seller have indicated full acceptance of this agreement by signing and or initialing it. For purposes of this agreement, the number of days will be counted from the execution date, excluding the day this agreement was executed and including the last day of the time period. All changes to this agreement should be initialed and dated. So again, just for an example, and I'll scroll down here real quick through my notes here. Okay. Can everybody see that? There's a sample there in the center. It says execution date is April 12th with 10-day contingency. So April 12th, it was executed. So day 1 starts on the 13th. Day 2 is the 14th, and all the way up to day 10, which is included, of April 22nd. Okay. That's what that's talking about.
It also doesn't hurt to communicate that with the other agent once you've accepted a contract with an email the next day. You know,
Yep.
just so that everybody's on the same page and we don't get into day 11 or 12 and now you've sent a change in terms in on day 12 and you only had a 10-day contingency. You don't have that problem if you communicate these dates with each other up front.
Yep. Section D, Part 5, the settlement date is not extended by any other provision of this agreement and may only be extended by mutual agreement of the parties. And how do we extend settlement if need be? Mr. Hubler?
Sorry about that. You got to use a change of terms and extend out from the original contract date. You got to put down the new date. But one thing I have a question for you is we've been finding, so say use that date of April 12th as a closing date and they want to close on April 10th. We've been finding agents have been sending us over change in terms to close sooner because the lender is making them do that, even though the contract states to close on or before. Has anybody else been experiencing that?
Yes.
Yeah, that
Yeah,
depends on the lender.
Yeah.
it also puts everybody on notice that this is the new date. And because what if the seller agreed to it verbally and then said, well, I can't be out till the 12th. I can't be out on the 10th, you know, or I can't make it now on the 10th. Let's move it back to the date we had on the contract, the 12th. If everybody's agreeing to the 10th, it doesn't hurt to have that change in terms, you know, signed. That way everybody's on the same page.
Makes sense.
Yep. Now, scrolling down through my notes again, I have down in a star here. Once you have a mutual agreement and executed contract, you should not go back and make changes or alter. Do it on an addendum that pertains to that change. Okay. So 5 weeks into the deal, they need you to change something for seller help. You don't change it on the contract and initial it. You go back and do a change in terms to make that change. Okay. So lastly, E, certain terms and time periods are pre-printed in this agreement as a convenience to the buyer and seller. All pre-printed terms and time periods are negotiable and may be changed by striking out the pre-printed text and inserting different terms acceptable to all parties, except where restricted by law. So for example, in the inspection contingency, they have down 10 days, 5 days, and 2 days. Those are all negotiable, and obviously there's a blank there that you can make a change to extend it or even lower it if need be. Usually if you do like a well and a water test and a septic test, you want that to be a little longer, 21 days, because it takes so long for those guys to get out. But you know, if it's just a home inspection and in this environment, if your buyer absolutely wants to do one, you may want to consider altering that down to you know, 4 or 5 days, just so that the seller knows that you're going to get it done in a timely manner. Okay. So we'll open it up for questions. Anybody have any questions or anything, any section of the first 2 pages? Nobody?
Kong, just
Yeah.
to clarify in regards to deposit monies being held, Jim Goldsmith put out a letter last week as part of his legal comment column, because it's more common these days for people to present deposit checks with their offers in multiple offer situations. He wrote a whole article on how long you can hold those without them being deposited. So the rule of thumb is that next business day rule, but it depends, right? You can hold them longer without cashing them. You know, for builders instance, if you write in that following section, it's not to be held by a real estate company. Obviously, real estate companies have to abide by the real estate commission rules and escrow rules. But if it's held outside of that, you know, they can hold it longer without it being cashed.
Yep.
So we can send that out, obviously, too, as part of our follow-up email.
Awesome. Anybody else have any questions? Okay.
Good job, Kung. I look forward to part 2 next week.
Yeah, next week is going to be fun. It's the mortgage contingency. I think that covers all 2 pages next week. So there's a lot in there because we're always like, what does the mortgage contingency really entail? And can a buyer really back out if they can't get a mortgage? You know, and we'll dive into that.
Good job, Kung.
Play different scenarios.
Important stuff.
Yeah, thanks, Gene.
Once we get this all edited and stuff, let's make sure we send this out to everybody, and hopefully the rest of the office can take a look at what you've done. Great job. Thank you.